boy, oh boy. Every once in a while I make a video and I'm uploading it or about to, or something happens and I delete it and I'm like, weren't you weren't gonna go far enough, Donovan. That's the problem. Gotta take it all the way there. The Oort cloud of politics, the objectivists, the libertarians, the nationalists, and out there the 10th planet, the white people, the white supremacist planet of white people, who everybody must fear. Planet X, Planet W. Will they invade? Well, so I thought, there's a topic I don't think I've read about from Renegade History of the United States, one of the most well known and least well known renegades. From Chapter 2, The Freedom of Slavery. When he rubbed burnt cork onto his white face, Dan Emmett knew the secret of slavery. When he let his body move on stage the way he never would off stage, he knew what the abolitionists would not say. When he sang songs of easy work and lazy days, told jokes about sex in black dialect, and heard his audience roar its approval, he knew what our history textbooks, still keep secret. Emmett, one of the creators of the Blackface minstrel show, knew that slaves enjoyed pleasures that were forbidden for white people. He knew that slaves were often the envy of America. Oh yeah, motherfuckers. Let's go. Whites imitating blacks is America's oldest pastime. It began on the decks of ships that brought the first slaves to the New World, where European crewmen gleefully joined the dances of their African hostages, and it continued on the plantations in the southern colonies, where masters and overseers were known to partake in the revelries in the slave quarters. But this curious phenomenon became a national obsession with the advent of steamboats and railroads in the early 1800s, when, for the first time, isolated white Americans from all over the country could easily travel south to see large numbers of black people in person. In the 1810s, soon after giant paddle wheel boats began carting passengers along the rivers that ran from Pittsburgh and Cincinnati to St. Louis, Memphis, and through the Mississippi Delta, and all the way down to New Orleans, white entertainers imitating black songs and dances became a common sight on the streets of major cities. By the 1840s, when the curious could ride a train from New York City to Pittsburgh, then take the steamboats to the cotton fields of Mississippi, whites all over America were acting black. The ethnomusicologist Dale Cockrell has estimated that by 1843, characters in blackface had appeared in more than 20,000 American stage performances. The facts are that blackface theater was extremely common, and Americans made ample opportunities to see it, often had to choose between competing performances on the same night, and attended blackface performances with enthusiasm. On the night of February 6, 1843, at the shabby, raucous amphitheater of the Republic in the Bowery district of New York City, Emmett and three other white men calling themselves the Virginia Minstrels made it into a form of art. That night, they put on the first theatrical performance devoted entirely to a blackface minstrel act. The quartet, dressed as slaves, sang songs and told jokes in black dialect, did their best to perform the dances that Emmett had seen on the streets of Cincinnati, on Kentucky plantations, and on the steamboats that plied the Ohio River. The performance was so popular that the theater in which it was staged soon began booking minstrel shows exclusively. By the middle of the decade, the Spirit of the Times, one of the leading theater journals in New York, reported that theaters staging minstrel shows are among the best frequented and most profitable places of amusement in New York. And while while an attempt to put on an Italian opera house has resulted in bankruptcy, the Ethiopian opera has flourished like a green bay tree. Dozens of minstrel troupes performed on New York's biggest stages and toured the country. Theaters devoted to the genre appeared in every major American city by the 1860s, and by the end of the century, blackface performance was a common, accepted, and respectable amusement. According to virtually all historians of American popular culture, it was the preeminent form of entertainment in the 19th century. Blackface minstrelsy is now often considered to be anti-black parody, and some of it certainly was, but scholars have recently begun to see the songs of Dan Emmett and many other performers in the genre as expressions of desire for the freedoms they saw in the culture of the slaves. Just as the minstrel stage held out the possibility that whites could be black for a while, but nonetheless white, David Roediger, the leading historian of whiteness, has written, it offered the possibilities that, via blackface, pre-industrial joys could survive amidst industrial discipline. One of Emmett's first songs was De Boatman's Dance, a tribute to the slaves and free blacks who worked on the steamboats of the Old South. Emmett admired what he saw as their embrace of pleasure, the freedom of their bodies, and their attitude that work was simply a means to fun. Hi-ho, the boatmen row, floating down the river de Ohio. The boatman dance, the boatman sing, the boatman up to everything. And when the boatman gets on shore, he spends his cash and works for more. Then dance the boatman dance, oh dance the boatman dance, oh dance all night till broad daylight, and go home with the gals in the morning. The tragedy of Dan Emmett's song about these black men, the tragedy of all minstrelsy, and of being a free white man, was that this kind of freedom could only be visited. I went on board the other day to see what the boatman had to say. There I let my passions loose, and they cram me in. They cram me in the calaboose. I've come this time, I'll come no more. Let me loose, I'll go on shore. If we dismiss the men who painted their faces black as deluded racists, we miss what they were telling us, even if subconsciously, about what free Americans were missing from their lives. As we will see, much of what they missed could be found in the real lives of slaves. Yet those who wished to be considered good American citizens knew that distancing oneself from all that African American culture represented was a principal qualification, so they allowed themselves to enjoy the pleasures of blackness only vicariously. And keep in mind, for all the black people who are starting to get more and more angry, this definitely doesn't apply to blues rock, jazz, hip hop music. Oh no. This everything's always different. History it doesn't even rhyme. Maybe it's called homage and not cultural appropriation. This is not an endorsement of slavery, but it is an argument that many freedoms we now cherish were available only to slaves in early America, and that citizenship in the young republic was a terribly constrained thing. It also reveals why slaves and their descendants were able to create a culture that has been so envied and resented, not just by white Americans, but also by the world. Emmett began writing songs of longing for plantation life soon after he saw slaves for the first time in 1834 when he arrived in Cincinnati from his home in central Ohio. Emmett encountered a city that was uniquely situated at the crossroads of slavery and freedom. Set among hills that looked across the Ohio River and onto plantations in Kentucky, there was no better place in America from which to compare the two cultures. Because it was the only major northern city located on the border between the two societies in Cincinnati, one could see a single day great numbers of fugitive slaves, free blacks and whites of every class, an immigrant group who worked, fought, danced, and slept together. It is certainly no accident that most of the creators of blackface minstrelsy spent time in the city known as the Queen of the West. Thomas Dartmouth, Daddy Rice, the father of the American minstrelsy, made his way from New York City down the Ohio River to Cincinnati, where he found inspiration for one of the classic characters of the American theater in a song about Jim Crow. Sung by a black stage driver, Stephen Foster began writing songs soon after he moved to Cincinnati to work for his brother's riverboat company. He produced a large portion of the minstrel genre, including Camptown Races, Swanee River, and My Old Kentucky Home. Dan Rice, perhaps the most famous blackface performer in the 19th century, and Abraham Lincoln's favorite, imitated the slaves and ex-slaves he encountered as a horse jockey and riverboat gambler along the Ohio River. Other minstrel performers traveled deeper in the South and sought company with slaves. Bill Whitlock, who gained fame as the banjo player in Emmett's troupe, toured plantations where he would quietly steal off to some Negro hut to hear darkies sing. To hear the darkies sing and see them dance, taking with him a jug of whiskey to make them all the merrier. God damn it. That's based. Oh my God. Soon after arriving in Cincinnati, see, I like honesty. I like when people are just like, boom, and they just let you have it. And you're like, damn. Now it's all me who has to do. You have no problem. You said your piece. It's me who now has to make a decision about what I'm going to do with all that. Somebody was putting on fucking Rockwell's dad, and then hearing what he had to say on TV back in the day, where you're like, holy shit, dude. Soon after arriving in Cincinnati, Emmett enlisted in the Army and was stationed at a base just over the river in Newport, Kentucky. According to his diary, he joined the marching band and practiced the drum incessantly. A year later, Emmett was transferred to a base in Missouri, a state where slaves made up more than 15% of the population. Discharged in the summer of 1835, the young musician returned to Cincinnati, but the songs he began writing show that he left much of his heart with the slaves. When he looked across the Ohio River, from the free north, he saw the promised land. I just arrived in town, for to pass the time away, and I settled all my business accordin'. But I found it so cold when up the street that I wished I was on the other side of the Jordan. So take off your coat, boys, and roll up your sleeves, for Jordan is a hard road to travel. In the late 1830s, Emmett joined a traveling circus where he began performing in blackface, imitating the slaves and ex-slaves he had encountered. Emmett performed with both the Virginia minstrels and as a solo act. A common theme in his music was a lament for having been born free. One of his troupe's most popular acts was a skit called Hard Times, a portrayal of life and freedom in which Emmett played a character named Showman, a chap that won't work. During the Civil War, Emmett wrote Road to Richmond, in which he imagined the regret of a slave who joined the Union Army. When I was young and in my prime, labor never done. I used to work, but it took my time. It was during the war that Emmett gained national prominence for his most famous song. Oh, yeah. Which today is known as the anthem of Southern racism, but for Emmett was actually a wish to be a slave. I wish I was in Dixie, hooray, hooray. In Dixieland I'll take my stand to live and die in Dixie. Away, away, away down south in Dixie. Freedom to me will never pay. Writing from Pittsburgh in 1851, a few years after leaving Cincinnati, Stephen Foster expressed similar regrets in Farewell, farewell, my Lily dear. Old master sends me roaming, so Lily fare you well. Oh, fare you well, my true love. Farewell, O Tennessee. Dan Emmett was just one of many songwriters who saw black men as objects of desire, as in Dandy Jim from Caroline. For my old master told me, I'm the best looking nigga in the country, oh. I look in the glass, and as I found it so, just as master told me, oh. Oh, beauty is but skin deep, but with Miss Dinah none compete. She changed her name from Lovely Dine to Miss Dandy Jim of Caroline. Mrs. Dandy Jim, there to Mrs. Dandy Jim of Caroline. There we go. That's why that read wrong. Much has been made of the occasional references to grotesque Negro facial features, but minstrel songs, particularly those written during slavery, more frequently referred to longings for beautiful slave women on the plantation. Benjamin Hanby's Darling Nellie Gray, a popular song in the 1850s, told of love amid the pastoral splendor of Kentucky. When the moon had climbed the mountain and the stars were shining too, then I'd take my darling Nellie Gray. We'd float down the river in my little red canoe, while my banjo sweetly I would play. The beauty of the land was often compared to the loveliness and grace of slave women, as in Stephen Foster's Melinda May. Lovely Melinda, as bright as the beam, no snowdrop was ever more fair. She smiles like the roses that bloom round the stream, and sings like the birds in the air. And John P. Ordway's Twinkling Stars are laughing, love, while your bright eyes look in mine, peeping stars they seem to be. Golden beams are shining, love, shining on you to bless. Like the queen of night you fill darkest space with loveliness. To the 21st century ear, these lyrics sound conventionally romantic, but to Victorian America, any such expression of physical desire, no matter how sweetly phrased, was disreputable, lowbrow, and black. Blackface minstrelsy was widely popular but not respectable. It was criticized on moral grounds, not because it was seen as racist, but because it was seen as wild, erotic, and free. There was no greater evidence of the freedoms experienced in blackface than the attacks on it by the keepers of American morality, newspapers catering to a genteel readership called minstrels demons of disorder who made night hideous. In one of its most outraged reviews, the spirit of the times declared, "But we scarcely believe a respectable audience would not patronize or encourage Negro buffo songs." Buffo, I have no idea what Negro buffo songs. "We hope they would not. It is a duty society owes to itself to discountenance everything which tends to vitiate public taste." The New York Mirror called on audiences to give blackface performers all the success they deserve, which is a sound and glorious pelting from the stage. A group of moral reformers in New York City was so alarmed by the first performed impersonations of slaves that in 1832 it purchased the theater that staged them and converted it to an evangelical chapel. White America was at war with itself. The two most popular characters in the world at the time, the Boston Post reported in 1838, are Victoria, the queen who symbolized bourgeois repression, and Jim Crow. But the creator of Jim Crow, T.D. Rice, claimed to know in his most famous song what was really in the hearts of the Victorians. I'm so glad that I'm a nigger, and don't you wish you was too, for then you'd gain popularity by jumping Jim Crow. Now, my brother niggers, I do not think it right that you should laugh at them who happen to be white. Case it all misfortune, and they'd spend every dollar if they could be gentlemen of color. It almost breaks my heart to see them envy me. The literary critic W.T. Lamon Jr., who has authored several path-breaking books on race. Oh, I should look him up. Race in American culture, grants that depictions of blacks in minstrel songs were stereotypes, but reminds us that there is no such thing as an accurate or authentic portrayal of black culture either. More important, Lamont argues that slave culture represented pleasure and freedom to blackface performers and fans, and danger to good citizens. In early minstrel shows, whites were identifying with blacks as representations of all that the YMCAs, which taught industrial discipline to urban youth, and evangelical organizers were working to suppress. The renegades, who rubbed burnt cork onto their faces in the antebellum period, unmistakably expressed fondness for black wit and gestures. Dan Emmett and the first generation of blackface minstrel performers were pioneering of what is now a global phenomenon. Blues, jazz, and rhythm and blues became more popular among whites than among African Americans, and there are now more fans of what is often called the music of freedom in Europe and Japan than in the United States. The same is true of hip-hop, whose white and non-American listeners outnumber the entire African American population. Radio stations from Orange County to Stockholm, Johannesburg, and Jakarta fill their playlists with sounds from the Bronx, Atlanta, and Compton. But to find the original source of this envy, we must return first to the lives of free white people in early America, and then to the plantation. I think I'll just stop there. From The Freedom of Slavery, Renegade History of the United States.